There exists substantial evidence to support the existence of a resource curse, or, more relevant for our purposes, an oil curse. Quantitative analysis of trends has been indecisive at best, but it is difficult to overlook the all-too-common progression that starts with an undeveloped state discovering oil reserves and ends with a corrupt government, crippled economy, and a significant portion of the populace living below the poverty line. Victor Monaldo and Stephen Haber explained in their essay, Do Natural Resources Fuel Authoritarianism, that, quote, the discovery, production, and export of natural resources is hypothesized to distort a country's regime type, putting it on a different path of political development than it would otherwise have followed. End quote. One need look no further for an illustration of such a curse than Nigeria, which nationalized its oil reserves following its independence in 1960. Today, Nigeria remains one of the poorest states in the world, with roughly 70% of its population living below the poverty line and an opaque government dependent upon oil revenue. What's more, it was just discovered that corrupt exploitation of the state's oil subsidy has cost Nigeria $6.8 billion over the past 3 years, roughly a quarter of its annual budget. The oil curse seems difficult to circumvent. Before going any further, I should spell out one very important qualification. The oil curse seems to apply only to undeveloped states. Already developed states such as Norway, the US, and the UK discovered oil reserves and were able to make their respective petroleum industries an integral part of their economies without political, social, or economic deterioration. The problems arise when undeveloped states strike oil and then attempt to utilize the newfound wealth to raise their status. It is easy to forego this distinction and dismiss it as little more than the logical status quo, but it offers valuable insight. Haber and Monaldo explain further that, quote, economic and physical reliance on petroleum, natural gas, and minerals helps create and perpetuate authoritarian political regimes, end quote. It is prolonged economic over-reliance on the part of leaders that creates all manner of issues. This brings me to the specific topic of my presentation, the importance of adroit leadership to making the oil curse an oil blessing. In making the distinction between blessing and curse, it would be useful to ask, what would an oil success story state look like? It would probably use oil revenue to improve the quality of life for its citizens. It would also probably use oil as a means to build up its economic infrastructure, such that other sectors could begin to step in as oil reserves began to dwindle, as finite resources are wont to do. It is tempting to say that the state would do all of this in kind with a democratic form of government, but as I will explain, rule by the people can actually hinder the self-betterment of a state through oil. I believe Richard Otte provides the best set of guidelines for a successful oil state. The first four are pretty standard as far as sustainable economic growth is concerned: access to public education, effective markets, an open trade policy, and economic diversification. But the fifth is the vital one when it comes to resource-driven economic growth. He calls it a developmental state, basically a state with sufficient autonomy to pursue coherent economic goals and to raise long-term social welfare. And here it starts to get a little sticky with regards to democratic forms of government. As anyone who has studied American government knows, a coherent and unified plan is difficult to formulate within the bounds of democratic and partisan politics, and it's even more difficult to do so expediently. Because a coherent plan is especially important for a state starting down the path of development, and because that plan must be decided upon quickly, lest the state be left in political and economic limbo, delegating such a task to democratic form of government can be damaging. It appears that, at least in the early stages, some level of sovereign leadership is needed to propel matters in the right direction. Advocating non-democratic government and a planned economy is a difficult position to take because of the prevalence of such cases gone awry. I could throw out some examples, but I don't think that's really necessary. What is worth noting, though, are instances in which such an approach has succeeded. The best example I have found of a state utilizing autonomous rule and a government heavily involved in directing the economy to bring about sustainable economic prosperity and a high quality of life for its populace is the United Arab Emirates. With the discovery of oil in Abu Dhabi and Dubai in the early 1960s, the Emirates began its transformation from a relatively backward desert region dependent upon a faltering pearl industry into the thriving economic and cultural center it is today.